Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I am going to be going through my 10 favourite albums by John Coltrane, and I will be ranking them in how much I like them. If I'm really honest, I like them all very, very much. I can't think of an artist that has made so many masterpieces. John Coltrane's discography is absolutely huge. I don't know if there's anybody out there who's really managed to get through all of it, and it goes through many different phases, and you may find if you want like one phase of John Coltrane, then the other phases might be a bit of a shock to you. It's a huge discography and it's a hard one to get your head around if you're approaching John Coltrane for the first time. John Coltrane has also made a number of classic recordings with other artists, most notably with Miles Davis, albums like Kind of Blue and Milestones, but also stuff with Thelonious Monk and a whole host of other incredible players. Coltrane is one of the great legendary musicians in jazz, and as I said, because of this, when you start to look at his recordings, it's at some point seems like masterpiece after masterpiece. I've omitted albums on this list which are some of my favourite albums of all time, but what I wanted to do was really try and represent the overall scope of what John Coltrane does, but most importantly give you the albums I like. And if you like the sort of stuff I'm into, you may find that this is a good place to start, right? And I'm going to start with my first album at number 10 with an album which is the earliest on the list, and it is this classic, Blue Train. There we go. Blue Train, which was recorded in 1957 and released in early 1958. Now, I think this is a good place to start. This is an absolutely classic album. But before we get to the album, let's just have a brief recap on who John Coltrane was. John Coltrane was born in 1926, the same year that Miles Davis was born, the same year Marilyn Monroe was born, and the same year that our sadly departed Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, was born. Okay, he comes up and emerges after a spell in the army as a saxophone player at the same year as Miles Davis. So he's working in the bebop era of the 1940s. He does not really make an impact at all at this time. So Coltrane is not one of these musicians that emerges on the scene. Coltrane takes a while to get going. All right, he plays with the Dizzy Gillespie big band. He plays with Tad Dameron. He's around Miles. He's around Charlie Parker, but he's a sideman. Now, I think the whole thing with Coltrane, when you start to analyse the way he approaches his music, he's like a force of nature, and he's continually moving forward like a train, you know, and he's on this track. And to start off with, it takes him a while to really get going. Every note that Coltrane plays has been achieved through immense hard work and focus. This guy used to practice a lot, but like many musicians of that era, he was blighted with heroin addiction. And I think this sort of keeps him out of the really high creative work that we associate with him until 1957, where he goes cold turkey and he gets off the heroin. Now, this he saw as a spiritual awakening. Now, this album was recorded in 1957, just after he'd gone through that process. And so this is the re-emergence of John Coltrane, and something's changed, and he's got a focus and he's got a direction. And for me, it starts on this album here. This album was recorded on Blue Note Records, the only album that Coltrane recorded for Blue Note. It's beautifully recorded, it's in the hard bop style, but we see the beginnings of where Coltrane's going to go. On the opening track, Blue Train, we have basically a blues, right? But it's a blues where the three chords, the 1, 4, 5, have been simplified right down to minor chords. And there's the beginnings of modality. The modality that Coltrane's going to become so proficient in and groundbreaking in is really going to be launched onto the world on Kind of Blue, which is going to be recorded a few years later. But we must remember that Kind of Blue, the concept behind that behind that album is it is a number of blues. It's Miles's exploration of the blues. That's why it's got blue in the title, and this one has blue in the title. This is a forerunner for me of what's going to happen on Kind of Blue. But also on the tune Moment's Notice, we start to see Coltrane taking the very material of the bebop musician, which is the fast expansion of the jazz cadence, the 2-5-1. And on Moment's Notice, we start to see him exploring this and taking what Charlie Parker had done and pushing at the limits of that cadence, pushing at the limits of the phrases that come from that cadence, and trying to open up a door towards more freedom in music. It's all contained on here. We also have I'm Old Fashioned, which is a jazz standard, Lazy Bird, which I think is a Tad Dameron tune. It's beautifully recorded, the lineup's incredible. Lee Morgan on trumpet, Curtis Fuller on trombone, John Coltrane on tenor sax, Kenny Drew on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and Philly Joe Jones on drums. This is an absolute masterpiece. It's also very accessible, it's beautifully recorded, and if you cannot stomach some of the extreme free jazz that we're going to be talking about on this, then this is a great place to start for Coltrane. Very accessible, very beautiful. And Coltrane, of course, is firing on all cylinders. Here he is, 1957, about to change the world. Right, so what have I got at number 9 on my list? Well, originally I'd put My Favourite Things in this position. And there was an album that was troubling me that I felt should go on the list. And originally I wasn't going to put it on the list. My Favourite Things is like a perfect album. It's a beautiful album. It's highly accessible. But on that album, Coltrane takes the tune My Favourite Things, which is ostensibly a jazz standard, in 6, in 3, if you want. And he sort of freezes the sort of vamp, the 2 minor chords moving, that opens up My Favourite Thing. He sort of freezes that and then uses that to create a level of freedom. And the thing about My Favourite Things is that he is pushing the envelope, but it's also sold so many records. It enabled him really to be commercially viable for the record companies, to produce this, you know, huge discography throughout the 1960s. Anyway, My Favourite Things is an absolute masterpiece, and I cannot believe I hadn't got it on the list, but I felt I needed to put this one on in its place. And it is an album on impulse called The Major Works of John Coltrane. Right, now this contains one of the great epic creations by John Coltrane, the album Ascension. It also has on the album Arm, Kula Samama, and Selflessness. This is exploring his later free period with his sort of free statement, which is Ascension. Now, Ascension for me is a difficult listen. And the reason for that is because he's assembled this huge band. It's very influenced by the double quartet that Ornette Coleman used on free jazz. Now, I want to get into Coltrane's move towards free jazz, because it can be quite troubling for musicians. Listeners. There are many listeners that just love the beautiful sound, the mournful sound of John Coltrane's saxophone, and they want to hear in a pretty situation like Blue Train playing jazz standards and sounding beautiful and mournful. That's what they want. Then there's the sort of the sort of jazz college, you know, listener, the guy that has discovered giant steps and wants to be able to play through giant steps, and they see Coltrane as this incredible blazing virtuoso able to channel their way through all these insane chord progressions and has opened up this door, and they feel that that's his great achievement, which is counteracted by all the free jazz that comes later on. Okay, Coltrane is trying to bust open music. He's trying to use the language of bebop and jazz, and he's trying to push it to push it so it breaks. He's trying to almost like take something which is one-dimensional and break it out into 3-dimensionals. It's quite an incredible thing. Those who just appreciate Coltrane because he can play through chord changes is not understanding why he's trying to do it. But his approach to freedom, which I said is like a train pushing forward and trying to push at the limits of music, when he gets to the 1960s, he then is faced with Ornette Coleman's approach. And Ornette Coleman's approach is much more playful. It's much more like let's just do whatever we want. You know, we don't have to worry about these chord changes. They're there. We can play them if we want. We don't have to play them if we don't want. There's so much other things in music you can do. It's like a conversation. Why don't you just like let go? And I feel that this really influences Coltrane at this point. And there's other musicians that are exploring free ideas, like the great John Gilmore from Sun Ra's band, and his influence from that. Coltrane isn't just a trailblazer. He seems to be a sponge of musicians around him. And with Ascension, it's almost like he assembles all these new free musicians around him to see what happens. And his concept is, he is very focused on music as an enlightenment, as music as a spiritual uplift. That pushing forward to him isn't just we need to move forward because we need to be modern. He is trying to push through to a spiritual awakening, maybe something that he opened the door to in 1957 when he got off the heroin. That is all tied up in this music. Ascension then becomes a sort of he's almost like championing the next wave of musicians. So Coltrane solos quite minimally on this. And when I was coming up, I wanted Coltrane. If Coltrane had spent the whole 30 minutes, you know, blasting through Ascension, I would have been pleased. But I was confronted with a whole host of different musicians. And also, at this time, Coltrane had this classic quartet with McCoy Tyner, Jimmy Garrison and Elvin Jones. They're on Ascension, but they're almost being attacked by these musicians that are coming in from outside. Whereas with Ornette Coleman's free jazz, you have these two definite quartets working. With Ascension, it's like you've got the Coltrane group, and then you've got musicians on top of it with a new way of approaching it. And it's actually quite chaotic. It's a difficult listen. It's not, for me, it's not it's not resolved. It asks to be resolved. It's about, you know, it's about Jesus Christ ascending to heaven, essentially. That's what this is about. But for me, it's full of attention and a lack of resolution. This album is, but it is an essential listen. And the reason why I decided to put this on is because this also contains a number of albums from that free period, which would be Arm, Kula Samama and Selfness of Sound. Arm is the famous album where Coltrane's supposed to have dropped acid on that album, and it was marketed almost to sort of the hippie psychedelic era area of listeners. I think his playing on it is unbelievable. Kula Samama explores sort of African influences. All these recordings for me are a little bit flawed, but to collect them all together like this, we have an incredible album's worth of Coltrane in the latter period of his free. It has to be considered. So at number 8, I have an album for me which is not that well known, and I can't tell you that much about it. It's an album I bought when I was 16 years old, and I just got into John Coltrane. And it is this album, John Coltrane Live at Paris. It's a double album. It is from the classic Elvin Jones, Jimmy Garrison, McCoy Tyner period, and it was recorded in 1965, right? At the same time, actually this was recorded after he'd made Ascension, okay? What we have with this album, which is absolutely incredible, is Coltrane is now fully in his free stage, but this album does not have Pharaoh Saunders and Rashid Ali and all these other people on it. This is an exposition of the classic Coltrane quartet exploring the limits of free jazz. It's unbelievable, this album is. Now this album was recorded obviously in Paris. I think it's from the same recording where they've called that live version of Love Supreme, but I might not be sure, and I'm sure now that these recordings will be out under another name. I bought this, as I said, 30 years ago when I won at school the Nina Grove Award for Art, and I have my sticker on the back of this album here, and I was given a record token, and I was very proud to then take that money and go and buy this album, which was a double album, which was pretty expensive at the time. This is really for me the album where I discovered free jazz. I love the Coltrane Quartet. I got a couple of albums of theirs before. This one was further out. I can remember sat listening to this, and at one point I remember thinking, it sounds like somebody's trying to kill a donkey whilst trying to tidy up a shed. There certain moments where these guys were really pushing it to the limit, but the energy and the pushing the envelope of what jazz does is mind-blowing. It's got a version of Naim on it. It's got a version of Impressions. There's a version of Blue Valse, which goes over a whole side, and halfway through the other side we have a version of Afro Blue, and then a second version of Impressions. It's a mind-blowing album. It's not all recorded in Paris. Some of it was recorded at the Antibes Jazz Festival, which is where I think that recording of A Love Supreme comes from. Anyway, there we have it. At my number 8, is Live in Paris by John Coltrane. Now, if you were to ask me what are the masterpiece albums of free jazz from his free jazz period, for me, there are 2, and here's the first one at number 7 or whatever number we're at the moment, and it is this one, Interstellar Space. All right, which was recorded in February 22nd, 1967. Coltrane died in the summer of 1967, so here we have one of his last recordings and perhaps his last absolute masterpiece. This is beautifully recorded, right? Coltrane is playing off the scale. It's interesting because it's just got him on tenor saxophone and bells, and it's got Rashid Atli on drums. There's no harmony here. It's just rhythm and melody, right? It's so beautifully recorded, and I'm so addicted to the late period of Coltrane, where he has managed to bust music open into 3 dimensions. He does this on the album Giant Steps, which of course will be on the list in a minute. And once he's done that, he uses that methodology, which is basically taking the jazz cadence and basically moving it into three different opposing keys. So if you draw the cycle of fifths and you take a key which is a major third part, it forms a triangle within that. And what he's doing is he's moving those cadences round that triangle in different shapes like this, round and round like that. And because those keys are quite far apart, the cadences almost start to encompass the whole of all the keys at the same time. And that was his approach. Very thoughtful approach of how you take the language of jazz and bust it out so you can move into these this freedom. If you listen to this, which is basically he's recorded a piece for every planet. It's a bit like his version of Holst the Planet. You know, he does Mars, Leo, which is would be what's Leo represent? I mean, that's an astrological sign. It's I wouldn't know. We've got Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. There's some bonus cuts on here. If you listen to it, he is doing exactly the same thing as he's doing on Giant Steps. He is utilising the same harmonic system on here, and maybe other ones that are related to it. If you stick your ears in and listen to what he's doing, it is absolutely fascinating. It isn't just noise. And if you take that approach, and I'm talking to the ones who are the Giant Steps obsessives here, go and check this out and analyse what's going on. But what he's done is now he's created that language. He then takes the harmonic framework away altogether, left with just the notes, just the melody and rhythm and tone, the very things that music are made out of. This is an incredible album. Right, so shall we move on to number 6? At number 6 I have Live at the Village Vanguard, a classic album. This features him with the classic quartet, although I do believe it's not Jimmy Garrison. This was recorded around about 1961, 62. It was released in 1962. So we have, I think, Reggie Workman on bass. We also have on here the great Eric Dolphy on bass clarinet. On Spiritual, Softly in the Morning Sunrise, he's playing soprano sax. Incredible. Spiritual's an incredible track which explores the same areas that My Favourite Things is exploring, which is why I felt I could take that one on the list. This for me is a greater album than My Favourite Things for me personally. On side 2 of the original vinyl, we had Chasing the Train, which filled up a whole side. It's over a quarter of an hour long. It's actually 16 minutes long. It's basically an abstracted blues. It takes this idea of the blues and it pushes it towards freedom. This, for me, that track, Chasing the Train, is the track where free jazz was almost born. In 1962, on that track, Coltrane had been moving forward, and he moves forward into this new area, which is really him visiting a place of meditation. It's a state of grace he's in. It's a violent, aggressive grace. You can hear the screams and trauma in that space. When he was recording this solo, he was so involved that he was moving around the stage, twisting and turning, and the guy that was recording it, which was probably Bob Thiele, was it? Yep. He had to sort of chase Coltrane around the stage with the mic, and that's why the track's called Chasing the Train. Little bit of a fact for you. But this is an incredible album. There is a box set of this, which is astonishing. So many recordings came out of this session. There's another album on the way in a minute, which has also came out from this recording, live recording session. This is mind-blowing. So I think we're at number 5 now, aren't we? So at number 5, I have the aforementioned Giant Steps. This is one of the greatest jazz albums ever made. This is where Coltrane, it's an early-ish album. I think it was recorded around about 58, 59. I'm not so sure. I would say 1959. It's a sort of 59, same era as kind of Blue. And Coltrane's pushing the envelope here. It's the apex of the early period. Yeah, this was recorded April 1959 and May 1959. It contains jazz standard after jazz standard. It contains Countdown and Giant Steps, which is where we have the summit of that sort of post-bebop approach and the beginnings of free jazz. That's what we've got in here. He also explores the blues on here. It's just an incredible album. I absolutely love this album as well, and I often think that the track Giant Steps, it overshadows incredible tunes like Mr. PC and Naima and Spiral Sider's Song Flute. Incredible. And for the people who are obsessed with Giant Steps, you have to go and listen to Countdown. On Countdown, it opens up just drums and saxophone as he winds his way through this twisted three-dimensional, 2-5-1 cadences. It's based around the Tune Up, which was a Miles Davis tune, which they would use. Very simple. It's just. I think it's 2-5-1s moving down in tones. I think. Not too sure about that, but it's basically just a series of 2-5-1s. And Coltrane's taken Tune Up and he has expanded it out, and it becomes Countdown. You see, that's the link. You see. This is a beautiful album, and it is also a great place to start for Coltrane. But it is the point of where Coltrane moves from that one post-bebop period into the realms of free jazz. And within that, we have the mighty quartet. Now, let's really talk about this quartet. In the same way as in the 60s, Miles Davis creates this classic quintet with Wayne Shorter, Ron Carter, Tony Williams and Herbie Hancock. Coltrane does the same thing. What would have happened if he hadn't have put this group together? Each member of this quartet was inputting to music an approach to playing which was equal to what John Coltrane was doing. Elvin Jones was taking rhythm and busting that out into 3 dimensions. He was using polyrhythms to be able to explore and hint at almost every single tempo that exists. And he does this in a frothing way which supports the soloists in a way which is sink or swim. There's an incredible story by Jack DeJohnette. When he was very young, he had played a gig at a club where Coltrane was about to play and Elvin Jones didn't turn up. And so at a very young age, he had to do the gig with Coltrane. And when he was interviewed, they said, what was this like? And he said, I would give Coltrane energy. I would give him this thing, and Coltrane would take it like a black hole and just suck that energy up. And so he would give him more energy, and Coltrane would take that in, right? This is what Elvin Jones was doing. It's an astonishing thing in terms of drumming. Jimmy Garrison is the double bass. It's the double bass hasn't got attack. It's a quiet instrument. There is a tension that exists in jazz, which I think has been forgotten a little bit in terms of the fact that most jazz is amplified or electrified in some way. These musicians weren't electrified, so you had an instrument that was very loud, the drum kits, it's naturally loud, and the acoustic double bass, which is very quiet. And that meeting in the middle dynamically, right, where the drummer's trying to contain it and the bassist is trying to reach up, that almost creates the dynamic world of jazz. It creates the dynamic world of the swinging rhythm section upon which all 20th century music is built. With the Coltrane Quartet, Jimmy Garrison is amping up, not really, in the way he plays the bass. It's almost like heavy metal. He's using power chords, and there is the element for me of almost like the flamenco strum. He creates a drive which allows Elvin Jones to open up. If you watch Elvin Jones at this time, he's got a tiny drum kit. So he's got this small sound, but it's explosive. And that rhythm section, the way they work together, is absolutely incredible. McCoy Tyner is like a musical genius that has an approach to jazz piano, which is loud, is aggressive, he's playing at incredible speeds, but with incredible dynamics, hammering the piano. And at the same time, he's comping behind Coltrane. He is using a lot of chordal harmony. He's using chords that are built out of fourths, and when you build a chord out of fourths, it hits at all the keys, because we have the cycle of fifths, we have the cycle of fourths, and actually the cycle of fourths is the uplifting cycle. A cycle of fifths is a descending cadence. The cycle of fourths is an uplifting cadence. And so that way that McCoy Tyner comps, the way that Elvin Jones and Jimmy Garrison play, is this energy. It's this energy thing that funnels up into what Coltrane's doing. It's quite incredible. The album I got at number 5 is almost like a classic example of that quartet at their peak, and it is this one, Impressions. What an album. This seems to have been forgotten a little bit. We've got 4 tracks on here. We've got India, where he plays soprano sax and he explores sort of Indian classical modality. We've got Up Against the Wall, which is a 3-minute track, and we also have on the end of side 2, After the Rain, which is a very, very beautiful, mournful tune. You can, on some of these mournful tunes of this period, you can almost hear him pulling some of the ideas that are going to go towards a Love Supreme. But the track Impressions, now Impressions is basically So What by Miles Davis. He's taken that modality. He's taking those, the sort of Dorian mode, which stays here, and then the cadence is just created by just moving it up and then moving it back down. And he takes it and he busts it open, he busts it out. Impressions, for me, is almost like if somebody said, play me a track by Coltrane, I want to hear what he's like, I may well play Impressions. I do believe that these recordings, except for maybe After the Rain, I think that's a studio recording, we got Roy Haynes on drums there, but we have the classic quartet on all the others. On India, we have Eric Dolphy on bass clarinet. That and Impressions come from the same recordings that produced live at the Village Vanguard. I mean, he turns up in a jazz club in November 1961, and they set some mics up, and in front of people having a nice drink and maybe a nice meal, tinkling their glasses, Coltrane makes masterpiece after masterpiece. To think that session that week produced Chasing the Train, Impressions in India, and a whole host of other incredible things. It's mind-blowing, Right, so we're now at number, that was number 4, so we're at number 3, aren't we? If you want to explore the late period, free jazz period, where, you know, Elvin and McCoy are on their way out, being replaced by, you know, Alex Coltrane, Rashid Ali, then there is an album which was recorded in that crossover period where you've still got McCoy, Tyner, Elvin Jones and Jimmy Garrison in the band, but you've got all these other players. For me, this is one of his supreme masterpieces. So, unlike Interstellar Space, which is definitely from the late period, this is the best for me of that free jazz period, where it's a greater album than Ascension. That's basically the same sort of idea, but it's a greater album. It is Meditations. I think this was recorded around about 65, 66. The lineup is John Coltrane. He's got McCoy Tyner on piano, Elvin Jones on drums, Jimmy Garrison on bass, but it's also augmented by Rashid Ali on drums and Ferris Saunders on tenor sax. We have the new guard. We have these new players in there. This is equivalent to A Love Supreme. It's an incredibly spiritual album. The tracks, you know, Compassion and Love and Consequences and Serenity are incredible. But the opening track, Father, Son and Holy Ghost, I feel is the peak recording of the free period. Coltrane is playing like nobody's ever played before. It's as though he's connected directly to the source of whatever creativity expression is on this. It's quite a mind-blowing album. So that's what I've got at number 3 is Meditations. What have I got at number 2? Well, it's probably going to surprise you. I did put it at number 1, and then I thought, now, if I had to have one album by Coltrane, it would not be this one. And the reason is because this album is very specific in what it does. It is one of the greatest albums ever made, not just one of the greatest jazz albums, one of the greatest albums ever made. It is, of course, A Love Supreme, an album that I literally worship. An album that changed my life. It's at number 2 on this list. On this album, he actually explores that experience that happened in 1957. Can you see what I've done here with this video? Can you see what I've done? So I've started with that and I'm ending with it almost. It is a prayer. It is a 4-part prayer. On the back, Coltrane has written this. Dear listener, all praise be to God, to whom all praise is due. Let us pursue him in the righteous path, yes it is true, seek and ye shall find. Only through him can we know the most wondrous bestowal. During the year 1957, I experienced by the grace of God a spiritual awakening which has led me to a richer, fuller and more productive life. At that time, in gratitude, I humbly asked to be given the means and privilege to make others happy through music. I feel this has been granted through his grace. All praise be to God. It's a prayer. It's a prayer of thanks. And I do believe that the last track, which is called Psalm, he is literally reciting a prayer on his saxophone. What can I say about A Love Supreme? I think it deserves a whole show. It deserves a whole video. It really is so important to music because it's probably the greatest exploration of spirituality in music. Every musician that comes in afterwards that does that, I'm thinking of people like, you know, Santana or the Mahavishnu Orchestra. It exists here in this music. And that transformative experience that Coltrane is embodied in music becomes a touchstone, I think, for the free expression of the 1960s. And so you feel that the psychedelic explorations of all these progressive rock bands, psychedelic bands, in some way has its roots in this album, including the way jazz jazz fusion musicians going to improvise. It's really hard to get across the how groundbreaking this one is. It is one of the greatest albums ever made. I mean, if I was going to say what are the greatest albums ever made, ever, it could easily be the greatest album ever made. And I've got it at number 2. What have I got at number 1? What I've got at number 1 is the first Coltrane album I bought, and I bought the right one. It really was the right album to buy. So I saw Coltrane on the TV. I saw that black and white TV show where Miles Davis comes on with his quintet and does So What, and then Gil Evans comes on and he does all the Miles Ahead tunes. I saw that, and when Coltrane did his solo on So What, it blew my head off. I thought, I've got to have an album by this guy. So I went down to my local record shop and they had a Coltrane album, and it was this one, Coltrane Live at Birdland. I took this home and put it on, and whatever he was doing on whatever he was doing on that track, he was doing on times 10 on here. And this album, whereas A Love Supreme is very methodical and episodic, and it's exploring this idea of spirituality, Coltrane does everything on this album, absolutely everything. It opens up with the tune Afro Blue. We have a blues, we have the sort of Latin American influences, we have the African influences, we have Coltrane on soprano sax. For me, yeah, there's my favourite things and a few other things like India, but for me, Afro Blue on this album is the summit of his soprano sax playing, which is another world in altogether. Then he does a jazz standard, I Want to Talk About You. It's a beautiful jazz standard, and at the end of that he goes into a cadenza. This cadenza is probably one of the most astonishing solos ever recorded by anybody, anywhere, in any period of time. Even now when you put it on, Coltrane is exploring an area of music which has only really been explored by, say, the Conlan Nankaro or people like some of the extreme metal. It's incredible. And the thing is, what he's doing on it, which is so... He basically takes this jazz standard and he turns it inside out, but you can sing the tune through it. It's incredible. You won't turn it over and it's got The Promise, and The Promise is like one of these beautiful modal jazz tunes. And then we have a couple of studio tracks. We have Alabama and Your Lady. Alabama, for me, which is a political recording, it explores the massacre, I believe at the time in Alabama, some horrible right-wing racist types went and blew up some church, killed some kids, and he is exploring that on here. And for me, Alabama encapsulates everything that A Love Supreme does. He does it here first. This album came out 63. It's just before A Love Supreme, which is 1964. Alabama is one of his greatest moments in music. It's just incredible. And then it finishes off with Your Lady, which ends with an Elvin Jones Coltrane break, you know, that thing where it's just drums and saxophone, and it's beautiful, and it's beautifully recorded. It's live. I think it's so important. You know, so many of these albums are live on this list. I think it's so important to realise what Coltrane was doing and how important it was to be in the moment. So, that there is my list of my 10 favourite Coltrane albums. And so if you're new to Coltrane, there might be some to go and check out. If approach Meditations, Ascension and Interstellar Space, approach those with caution. They are difficult albums, but it's rewarding. But to start there may well be a very difficult thing to understand if you haven't gone on the journey that I've tried to describe through this. So many of these lists don't tend to really dwell on the late free jazz albums. For me, that is where the journey arrives at. As Coltrane said, he had a spiritual awakening, and in that he was just so prolific in producing this masterpiece after masterpiece as he was moving forwards towards something on the incredible, devastating fact that in 1967 he found out he had liver cancer, and it seemed very quickly he was gone. And so we are left with this legacy, this journey to that point. Where would he have gone after this? We can maybe guess by listening to, say, what Pharoah Saunders or Alice Coltrane did. And in both of those, there was a move almost to an embrace of humanity in the accessibility of some of that music. Not easy to listen to, but far more spiritual and open-armed. I feel that Coltrane was moving to something, rather than get more and more complex, he was moving towards something more and more simpler. But we will never know. I would like to have thought he would become a jazz fusion musician. And I can imagine that, maybe he would have been doing stuff like the Brecker Brothers by the mid-90s. Who knows? But the thing is, we never will know. What we have here is this just incredible 1957 to 1967, 10 years. It's produced how many albums? 100, 200 albums? It's one of the great achievements musically in the history of all music. As I've said many a time, there's 4 musicians that underpin this channel. Miles Davis, Frank Zappa, John McLaughlin and John Coltrane. And John Coltrane's the guy I'd speak about the least, so I'm really chuffed to have done this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, then don't just sit there, stick a like. Go and stick a like on my thing, because it helps the algorithm, right? If you haven't subscribed, why haven't you subscribed? Maybe because you hate my channel. Maybe you've just come across this and it's the last thing I want to see. Well, you don't you subscribe. But if you watched a few videos, I'm not going to stop. There's a lot of videos here, so press the subscription. But then you can be notified, maybe, if the old YouTube algorithm is still doing that. But you'll be notified that I'm doing stuff. If you want to support me, support what I'm doing, but not just support me, get involved with what I'm doing, then please become a Patreon. The link is down below. And if you don't want to become a patron but still want to support me financially, you can stick some money in my PayPal tip jar. It's very straightforward. I am receiving payments through that, and it's making the possibility of me doing more with this more and more viable. It really is, and I can't say too much about that at the moment, but I hope in the future at some point I will be able to announce something quite incredible. But it's all about the money. And of all the videos for me to end on that, it should not have been the Coltrane video, because Coltrane was not about the money. He was about the music. It was about the spiritual uplifting, but I think he did pretty well out of it. I was watching a film the other day of him in his house. He seemed to have a relatively nice house for someone that just made squonking, inaccessible free jazz, So where am I going with this? Shall I shut up before I spoil it? Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.